So I want to present Jimbo Head.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Any need for the...
You need it for the, we need it for the recording.
As Alan mentioned, let's see here, check. As Alan mentioned, I am going to be, this morning's message is very well related to this book entitled The True Measure of a Man. I just wanted to thank Alan, men like Bob Sullins, who I met a couple of years ago in Birmingham, and Bob has been a faithful follower of what we're doing in Birmingham, and I know he's been involved with this content here and other men here in Nashville, and I hope you'll say thanks to Paula for me. She was very helpful yesterday, and really appreciate what she's doing. The books that you see out here on this table, they're for you. There's some pricing on there. But if you guys are unable to pay this morning, I would like to get your name and email address, preferred email address, if you can provide that. If you'd like to take a copy, you're not prepared to pay for it, we'll email you and we'll settle up later. So the main thing is we would like for you to be exposed to the content that we have if you find any of it to be of interest to you. So feel free to take it. If you can pay for it, you can throw your cash in the bucket there, and we'll ride on. So we also I do want to say this: we for the most part we've been lagging behind. Our ministry has in the technological world. Don't need to tell you that. Evidenced by what happened last spring. Unfortunately, we did not realize the magnitude of the capability that we needed. But anyway, we are getting ready to launch an online version of what we do at the Center for Executive Leadership, and we're going to be making available Richard's messages in video, audio, and transcription of notes and so on and so forth. And if you think you may have an interest in that, then this morning as well, if you would put your name and email address there, we'll make sure that we get back to you. This site is currently under development, but we expect to have it up rolling very, very soon. So, we all live with these devices in our hands. That's the way most of us receive our information, and it determines the direction for our day. And so we simply want to expand our outreach and help more men. That's basically what we want to do. Our ministry is engaged primarily in working with businessmen. Richard Simmons, who Alan referenced, he is a 30-year business executive, formerly in the insurance industry, and he was CEO 10 of the last 30 years of that organization. So he has a business acumen and has a very, very good gift of communicating, particularly with businessmen. So with that, I want to get into the message today, and I just want to say that in thinking through how my faith and relationships with Christ has shaped my life, I can't help but think of how it has shaped my perspective on masculinity and what it really means to be a man. We're going to talk more about this. Growing up, how many of us were exposed to just the statement, be a man? You just need to be a man. Anybody ever had your dad or uncle, grandfather tell you that? I think most of us had. And so I wonder what, the younger generation coming along now is thinking about this kind of thing. What are they being told, and how are they reacting to it? what do our boys, men, sons, son-in-laws, what do they think of, when we say things like, I want you to be tough, I want you to be strong, you're not supposed to show any kind of emotion. That's kind of how I was trained coming up. But most of these men, particularly today, have no concept of what it really means to be a man. Perfect example of this, there's a book called Season of Life. Anybody ever heard of it? Written by Jeffrey Marks. If you haven't, I would encourage you to get it, especially if you have a son. And the story is about two high school football coaches who are in the business of teaching these young men in high school what it really means to be a man. And in the process, they are winning state championships. Very well respected. Kind of an interesting duality there. And one of the exercises that Joe Ehrman talks about, and you can Google this guy, Joe Ehrman, he was a former All-American, I think, at the University of Indiana. He went on to play, be a number 1 or number 2 round draft choice for the Baltimore Colts as a defensive lineman. His story is incredible, and he knows men. He probably knows men as well or better than anybody that we know. But it's interesting, one of the exercises that he gets a lot of men to do is he says, I'll hand out a 3x5 index card to them and simply ask them to write on the card their definition of what it means to be a man. Has anybody ever done that? Anybody ever asked you to do that? Well, we're not going to do it this morning. But the interesting thing that he notes is he says the responses are, men are dumbfounded by this question, and it kind of stumps them. He said, normally when I collect them, I'll get things on the card that relate to their career, their accomplishments, and things of that nature. So that's the majority of what he receives. It's an interesting exercise. Tells us a lot about who we are. But today I want to share some thoughts with you about being Christian men in the culture that we live in. Several years ago, Warren Buffett, in his annual letter to the shareholders, wrote about fear and the economy. You may remember this, back in about 2008, I think it was. And he used the word fear a number of times. Most significantly, he said, the credit crisis has produced a paralyzing fear that has engulfed the entire country. But of course, real men are never afraid, are we? Not much that intimidates us. Fear is an interesting emotion because it's created by uncertainty over the future. I've heard the acronym FEAR, false expectations appearing real. Kind of interesting. Most men do not know how to deal with it, and therefore it runs wild in our imagination. I know we've all experienced this. It creates this idea and illusion in our minds that we've got to be something that we're not. What if Alan found out something about me that I'm involved in, that I'm not particularly proud of? Real men are not supposed to be afraid. The prominent psychologist Larry Crabb, many of you may have heard of Larry Crabb before, had the opportunity to meet with him and talk with him a couple of years ago. He cites two basic psychological needs that we have as men. Number one is the need for security, And number two, and probably most importantly, is the need for significance. Now, he contrasts this with women, on the other hand, that they have a greater need, mostly. Most women have a greater need for security. Things like having the mortgage paid off. Things like being able to properly or adequately educate the children. Things of this nature. But we as men have a far greater need for significance. Would you agree with that? And our fears go much deeper when our significance is threatened. You may be wondering, what is this need of significance that I'm referring to? And basically, it's to feel like that our lives are important. We have value. There's value in who we are and what we do. No man wants to get to the end of his life and believe that his earthly existence didn't account for anything or for very much. Sadly, and very silently and very quietly, many men struggle with this universal fear that their lives don't amount to much. How many of you are familiar with the movie or the play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof? I know most of the older generation is. It's kind of an interesting movie made many, many years ago, 1955-ish, I guess it was. Paul Newman was I think one of the lead actors in there. But if you're not familiar with it, the story involves a history of a troubled, wealthy family who live on a large country estate in Mississippi. So I'm going to set the tone for you. And the patriarch of the family is an older, intimidating man, daddy, they call him Big Daddy. And Brick, one of his two sons, is an aging football hero who struggles with alcohol. He's married to a girl by the name of Maggie, who goes by the name of Cat in the movie. And Brick and Maggie are childless, and they have a very turbulent relationship, largely because of Brick's neglect of her. Well, at the end of the movie, Big Daddy learns that he doesn't have very long to live. And so he and Brick have a very pointed exchange, and he's trying to describe to Brick the tension that exists between gaining wealth and finding a lifetime of significance. Does that sound familiar? Listen to what he says. This is in 1955. I'm worth $10 million in cash and blue chip stocks. But there is only one thing you can't buy on any market on earth, and that is your life when you know it is finished. The human animal is a beast that must eventually die, and if he has money, he buys and he buys and he buys, and he hopes one of the things he buys is life everlasting. Clearly now, the life everlasting that Big Daddy is referring to is not to be taken in a spiritual sense, but rather as his desire to leave, that his earthly life would have some sense of permanence, if you will. In other words, he didn't want to be forgotten. And so Brick, his son-in-law, asked him, he says, Big Daddy, why are you so desperate to have grandchildren? Remember, Brick and Cat are childless. And the answer is very revealing. He says, I want a part of me to keep on living. I won't have my life end at the grave. At the end of his life, Big Daddy has realized that the wealth he has accumulated over the course of a lifetime could never purchase what he most desired: significance. There's a similar real-life story shared about former President Lyndon B. Johnson through the famous presidential biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin. And in a commencement address, she addresses this, and she captures this same truth when speaking of former President Johnson. Listen to what she says. "A month before he died, he spoke to me with immense sadness in his voice. He said he was watching the American people absorbed in a new president, forgetting him, forgetting even the great civil rights laws that he had passed. He was beginning to think his quest for immortality had been in vain, that perhaps he would have been far better off focusing his time and attention on his wife and his children, so then he could have had a different sort of immortality through his children and their children in turn. He could have depended on them in a way he couldn't depend on the American people. But it was too late. 4 weeks later, he died. Despite all his money and power, he was completely alone when he died. His ultimate terror realized." It's hard to believe that a man could achieve this kind of a status and position as one of the most powerful men in the world and not feel like and believe that his life accounted for much. I think there are times in each of our lives, I know it's been true with me, when we wonder if we're on the right track. We wonder if our lives really matter and if we are making a difference as men. This is particularly true today. So I want to share with you a couple of ideas that you can take with you and reflect on today. I can remember many years ago as a young Christian encountering the verse in Romans 8:28 for the very first time that reads, "We know that God is causing all things to work together for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose." Now, at the time, I thought, what a great verse. In other words, whatever is happening in my life, God is working for my good. But the problem that I had was the way I was interpreting the word good. I believed then that God was saying that I am causing all things to work together for your comfort, for your pleasure, and for your prosperity. I believe this was what the good life was all about. This is where significance could be found. And that surely God would want this for my life. Then I encountered someone a lot wiser than me, which happens quite often, and they said, "Jimbo, why don't you read verse 29 so that you can get a little bit better understanding of what God's definition of good is?" So I did. And in Romans 8:29, it talks about how we are to be conformed in the image of His Son. This is really the greatest good for our lives, that I might become Christ-like, particularly in my character. One of my favorite quotes outside of the Scripture comes from a man by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was a Russian atheist. He gave a very harsh commencement address at Harvard University. He was thrown in a Russian prison for many, many years. And he went in as an atheist. He came out as a transformed Christian. Listen to these words. He said, I bless you, prison. I bless you for being in my life. For there, lying on rotting prison straw, I learned that the object of life was not prosperity, as I had imagined, but it is the maturing of the soul. So he raises a valid question. What is the object of life? For most people, it's prosperity, comfort, and pleasure. But Solzhenitsyn came to a different conclusion. His conclusion was it's a maturing of the soul. So, the Apostle Paul, in addition, along this line, says, our being conformed to the image of God's Son. So the first point I want to make here this morning is, ultimately, we will be remembered, guys, and known for who we are as men, and not for what we have accomplished. Now, you may be thinking, how can I make a change at this juncture in my life? Is it too late? Do I have enough time? What should I be thinking about? Well, we as men, I think you'll agree with me here, we're always looking for a technique or a formula to fix it. This includes ourselves. You know, Alan, if you'll just give me the technique and the formula, I'll go fix it. I'll go fix myself. Now, this is better known as behavioral modification, guys. But behavioral modification is not the issue here. We're talking about a heart change. We're talking about something that we don't have the capacity and the capability to do. We cannot change ourselves internally through our heart. God is the only one that can do that. Now, what I have learned personally, and I think other men that we meet with and counsel with, is the deeper we go in our relationship with Christ, the greater the transformation that takes place in our own lives. Remember, most of us are looking for the technique and the formula, so I can go do it. Now, he says, I want you to tune in to me. I want you to walk with me. It's not going to jeopardize your other relationships with people. In fact, it's going to enhance it. It's going to encourage you, and it's going to give you the capacity to love and to receive love. So please hear me. I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about trying to be good. I'm talking about the life of God working in the hearts and souls of men through the power of the Holy Spirit. It's God enabling us to do that which we cannot do ourselves. Now, in order to explain my next thought, I need to share with you what I consider to be a foundational truth of our philosophy. And that is, in the Bible, there's a word that pops up from time to time, and the word is beware. Jesus uses this a lot, beware. His primary use of the word beware is to warn us of believing what is false. In fact, the great French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal said, the primary reason men struggle so much in life is because we have false ideas about reality. And he believed that it was crucial to uproot these false ideas and replace them with wisdom and truth. I believe that what really tends to mess up our lives as men is that we have developed false ideas on what it means to be wealthy and what it means to live a successful, significant life. I want to take a minute and focus on this. You know, what is true wealth and success? Because I believe you will see that they converge and they are connected. You'll see that these two clearly point to a life of significance. One of my favorite parables in the New Testament comes out of Luke 12. And this is Jesus talking about a particular man, a businessman, just like us, engaged in commerce every day. Listen to what he says. He says, the land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have made many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. What's he saying here? You know, this is a parable about a businessman, and it is a parable, but this guy's business is thriving. You kind of get the picture here. His business is thriving, and he's planning, he's contemplating the future. This is good. This is a good thing. This can be a good thing. We need to do this as businessmen, because planning and expanding our businesses is good. We can provide for jobs. It's good for the community, increases the tax base. Herein lies the situation. Jesus has a problem with this man's approach to life. In other words, he has been blessed with a great deal. This guy has been blessed. He's been given a gift to achieve economically and make a great deal of money. But his plan, the man's plan, was to devote all of his resources to pleasing and gratifying himself. A life of self-indulgence, if you will. And in the end, how does God sum up this man's life? He calls him a fool. So, as men, our greatest fear should never be a fear of failure in terms of taking risks or maybe focusing on what others may think about us. But the fear that our greatest success in life is something that really just doesn't matter. When you get down to it, it just doesn't matter. Now, I realize that what I just read is just a parable. But what if this man's attitude had been something like this? Once I have expanded my business, then I'll be able to help the community. I'll be able to contribute more into the community. I'll be able to help the less fortunate and the poor. Maybe I can even help expand the ministries at Brentwood United Methodist Church. So real wealth and success involves investing our lives in a cause that is bigger than our own individuality. Let's be honest. You know, this world that we live in is built on speed and noise. And we live in a culture that measures significance by building a business, accumulating a large fortune, and now being a celebrity. You see this celebrity status stuff all over the place now. But the Bible seems to suggest that true significance is measured by serving and impacting the lives of others, particularly in order to advance His kingdom. Listen to the words of Max Anders. They're powerful. He says, everything God does is eternally significant. When we are submissive to what He is seeking to accomplish through us, we find ourselves participating in the eternal. This is a life of significance, participating in the eternal purposes of God. Let me ask you a question. How do you see your job if you're still working? Or if you're retired, no longer working, how do you see your current situation? Do you see it as a divine calling or just some drab exercise and responsibility that you have to put up with? Is it one that serves others through making a meaningful impact in their lives? Or is it one that's focused on serving and providing for your own needs? What kind of man are you? What kind of man am I? Back to the parable real quick. Consider the words of Jesus to this man when He says, "You fool. Such is the man who stores up riches for himself, but is not rich toward God." In Luke 16, Jesus uses a different phrase when He speaks of this, and He calls it the true riches of life. What do you think Jesus means when He refers to as the true riches of life? What does He talk about? Well, He's talking about things like a good name, our character. How is our character doing? What kind of man are we becoming? Let's forget about living life in the rearview mirror. What type of man are we becoming? What about our wisdom and understanding? What kind of decisions am I making that will get me on a path that will produce the kind of consequences that have eternal significance? Because intentions ain't going to get it. Intentions aren't worth anything. We've got to select the path that will take us to the destination that will produce the consequences that have eternal value. What about our earthly relationships? How do we treat each other? How do we treat our families, children, grandchildren, co-workers? You know, you're looking at one selfish, self-centered individual growing up. I get that. I know that it exists in here. But it doesn't have to be that way, guys. The Apostle Paul says there is one thing in life that's more valuable than anything else. In Philippians 3:8, in fact, he says, I count all things to be a loss compared to the possessions of the priceless privilege and surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have lost everything and consider it rubbish. Doesn't matter. It's worthless. In order that I might gain Christ. Paul is telling us that he has found now this life's great treasure that Jesus talks about in Luke 16. It's that pearl of great worth. It's what we're all looking for, guys. It's that hidden treasure. He has found in this treasure significance. So, I want you to consider, as we've been looking at this morning, how are you going to walk the rest of this thing out? You going to try to do it by yourself? It's a tough road to hoe. Christ says, I'm here. Walk with me. You know, he in fact tells us that I will tell you great and mighty and wonderful things that you do not know. So despite our thinking that we know it all, that we're educated because we're educated and knowledgeable, we don't know it all. That's kind of a relief. It was a relief for me. I want to read to you the words of Dr. Peter Moore, who is the founder of Trinity Seminary, and he is reflecting on his 25-year college reunion at Yale. He says, returning to my 25th reunion at Yale, I watched as Mercedes-Benz's disgorged, prosperous-looking members of the class of 1958 and their wives at the gates of the old campus. The program announced that former classmates were preparing to tell the rest of us about the lessons they had learned climbing ladders of success. Does that sound familiar? Wandering along familiar campus pathways that first evening of the reunion, two questions weighed heavily on my mind. Number one, had I been a success? Number two is, what was success? The occasion, redolent with nostalgia, demanded such questions be asked and answers at least attempted. After all, what had one to show for all the expensive education after a quarter of a century? I tried to be as honest with myself as I could. I refused to take easy refuge in pat answers that, after all, I had started this and done that. While I was thus musing, suddenly I remembered that a friend who was a rector of a nearby church had invited me to join him and a handful of parishioners for their customary 5 p.m. evening prayer. I hurried across campus to St. John's and took my place as the service opened, still very troubled by the questions I couldn't shake from my mind. We came in time to a familiar part of the service recorded in Luke 2, where the aged Simeon picks up the Christ child in the temple and blesses God with these words, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. Listening to these words, I felt a quiet assurance settle in my soul. All the anticipation of wise old Simeon's many years found joyous fulfillment in one moment's realization that there in his arms was the long-awaited Messiah. Such was the sense of completeness that his knowledge gave him. He was now ready to depart or die in peace. In the quiet of that service, I discovered what real success was. It came to me quietly, but it came very clearly that the only thing worth calling success was coming to the knowledge of God and being able to behold Him in the face of His Son. It seemed to me a knowledge so profound and yet so simple that it made even the smallest accomplishment of great importance when done in its light. What a perspective. So, I want to share on it and wrap this up with a final thought in a story. As we consider our lives as men and look at the future, I want to read a verse to you from Paul's letter to the Colossians. It's found in chapter 1 and it's verse 27. It talks about, to whom God willed to make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So I ask you to dwell on that. What is the hope of mankind? What is that hope? It's Christ in us. This is the hope of glory. You know, the gospel is often compared to a tiny seed, and seeds have a paradoxical strength to them. You take an acorn that seems so small and maybe insignificant, yet there is everything in that acorn to grow into a powerful, huge oak tree. And out of that oak tree come hundreds of other acorns. So a single acorn has the power in it to cause the entire force of the earth to be filled with wood. The gospel is kind of like that. It comes into our hearts and its organic power is released. And if it grows and is nurtured, then we will become what the prophet Isaiah calls oaks of righteousness. That's what that term looks like. We will become the men He intended us to be. There's a man by the name of Campbell Morgan who shares a really interesting short story, and I'm going to wrap this up. He talks about being in Italy and going into an old graveyard. He says there was one very old grave that was centuries old. It was apparently the grave of some prominent, wealthy man. And there was an enormous thick slab of marble over the grave, yet an acorn had somehow worked its way and wedged its way into the grave, and over the centuries had grown up out of the side of that piece of marble. It developed into a huge, huge tree, and it cracked the slab of marble, and it actually rolled it off and broke it off into two pieces. This was so amazing to people that a little acorn could do this over time. Yet, when a little acorn is given a chance to release its power, it can do something that even a team of horses couldn't do. The seed, men, represents Jesus. And He releases His power into our lives when we surrender our hearts to Him and walk with Him through this life. And so this is the question we need to examine and answer. What kind of marble slab might I have over my heart? What I've learned in my work with men is it doesn't matter how broken or dysfunctional or what you have experienced, what we have experienced on the inside. If we bring the power of Christ into our lives, it has the power to crack and roll this slab completely out of our lives. This is the hope Christ offers to a broken world. This is the hope. And it's the same hope that he offers to you and me. In the book, The True Measure of a Man, where a lot of this wisdom came from, there's a question in here that deals with us as performers and our desire to compete. That's a good desire. You know, God designed us that way. Competition is good. But the question we need to come to grips with that has eternal significance is, who is the audience that we ultimately are performing for? So I want you to think through that. I want you to kind of dwell on that. There are 3 questions that I provided Alan with for your groups, and I'll just read them to you because I don't think we had time to make the copies.
Maybe just write it down on your tables, that'd be great.
Alan, we okay on time? Okay. Here, question number 1 is, how much different, I'll repeat this, how much different would your life be if it were not for the fear of failure? Number 2 is, how much different would your life be if it were not for the fear and worry about what others think of you? And the last question, again, I'll repeat them if you need me to. Last question is, how much of your life and money have you wasted trying to gain the approval of others? You guys have been a great audience. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.